Over 12,000 individuals have read an article on the Child Nexus platform about slow processing speed. In this article, one of our Child Nexus members describes a sweet, bright, creative kid who struggles with working quickly. And she was diagnosed by a school psychologist with slow processing speed. And she notes that sadly, the child's teacher hadn't gotten the memo. Today, we're going to talk about slow processing speed because I've seen it a lot in my practice, and it fits the profile of so many kids who struggle in school. And my guest today is an expert on the topic. My guest today is Dr. Ellen Braaten. She's the founder and executive director of the Learning and Emotional Assessment Program at Massachusetts General Hospital, the Kessler Family Endowed Chair in Pediatric Neuropsychological Assessment, and associate professor at Harvard Medical School. She's a widely recognized expert in the field of pediatric neuropsychological assessment, particularly in the areas of learning disabilities and attentional disorders. She's also the author of an amazing book, Bright Kids Who Can't Keep Up. I'm so thrilled to welcome her to the podcast.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Dr. Braaten, welcome to the podcast.
It's so great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm so thrilled. I told you before we actually hit record that I've been wanting to have you on the podcast for such a long time because I've been following your work, at Harvard, and we both do work for Understood. And I just think that the videos and the information you provide to families is just so valuable and so important. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I really admire your work as well. So this is a mutual admiration podcast.
And, when I was thinking about having you on the podcast, I was just thinking that we both work with kids who take a very long time to get things done, whether it's getting up in the morning, getting into the car to go to school, completing homework assignments or chores. And what we find is that oftentimes these kids struggle with processing speed. And I've seen it many times in my practice and, in the cases that I supervise at UCLA. And you are the expert on processing speed, which is why I wanted to have you here. So I would love for you to tell our listeners first, we'll start with what is processing speed? Because, the examples I just gave, a lot of parents will say, that's my kid, that's my son, that's my daughter. What exactly is processing speed?
So processing speed is how long it takes us to get something done in a given period of time. And it can be verbal processing, meaning it can be how long it takes you to hear something and develop a response to it. It can be visual. It can be something like being able to react quickly enough to what's going on in the environment. And when you think about social skills, thinking about visual cues are important, and also language is important. So processing speed can be important to that. And then it also implies motor speed. When we're talking about processing speed as neuropsychologists, though, we're really kind of talking about a special weakness in an area of neurocognitive functioning, which is usually the processing speed index on the WISC. And what I have found is that when we look at tests of cognitive functioning, kids who have trouble in that one area or a difference in that area, it's not even sometimes trouble. That's not even a very good descriptive word to use anyway, but it can be a difference between higher areas of cognitive functioning in other areas, like verbal and nonverbal reasoning. And then processing speed can be quite average. So that discrepancy can be just as impairing to kids as having a real normative difference in processing speed. So we're really talking about those kinds of timed tests that we use. We're not really talking about, we're talking about processing speed, about how long it takes you to kick a soccer ball, for example, those kinds of overlearned motor skills. We're really talking about a particular way of processing information. And some people just take a long time to sort of see something and generate a response.
And that's what we mean when we talk about slow processing speed. It's those individuals who take a longer time to kind of do the things that you've described.
Yes. In fact, some kids have referred to it as sort of being dreamy, for example. They need time to sort of look at something. And the test that we use to measure it, one of the best tests we have is called the coding test from the WISC. And it basically just asks kids to look at a code and then copy it as quickly as they can. It's that very simple sort of processing that we're talking about. We're talking about processing speed as we measure it. But in reality, those simple things have really significant consequences to lots of other things that we do in life, like social skills, like being able to generate a narrative when we're writing an essay, or even just being able to talk with someone and express our needs clearly and quickly.
Right. And what I'm hearing from you as you describe it, it can take different forms. So it's not just the ability to write quickly. It can be verbal, motor, academic. We often see it with kids who can't do math tasks quickly or can't write quickly or read quickly. And so it can impact so many different areas like you've described.
It can. And in our testing, what we see are kids who struggle on different aspects of timed tests. And that's where a test evaluation can be very helpful, because we can pinpoint some of those things. Some kids are really quick at coming up with the right word at the right time, but when it comes time to actually write that word down or use that word in a sentence, they struggle. So that's where an evaluation can be very helpful in teasing some of these things out. But you're right, academic fluency, that ability to just do the simple parts of academics, can really be impacted by slower processing speed. So the child might have the right answer to the question. It might take them longer, but they might have trouble doing that basic math facts, minute math, those sorts of things. Just disastrous for those kids.
For so many kids. And it's not that they don't know the information, it's that they can't, show that they know it within that time period, which can be so frustrating to so many kids.
Yes. And oftentimes the way I explain it to kids and parents too, is that the easy stuff is hard and the harder stuff is easier. And so, but we need that easy stuff in order to be able to do. If we're in a math test and we know how to do the problems, but we can't access those simple math facts quickly, it's going to slow us down. And that 1 second here, 2 seconds there, all of a sudden we haven't finished the test and now we're feeling anxious, which is another piece of this puzzle too. And then that slows us down even more. So that's where it's a really complicated issue for a lot of kids.
Yeah, it's complicated. But yet so many people don't understand it, particularly if you're seeing a kid who seems really bright. And you talk about this in your book. Kids who seem very bright are able to do things at a very high level. And then they're just taking forever to do things. It can often seem to parents and to educators that they're not motivated, they're lazy, they're not trying hard enough, but it's really tied to the way their brain is wired.
Yeah, and it really feels lazy to when you're living with a child who has slower processing speed, you just think like, just move, just do something, go. And they really can't. And being like that makes it even worse, because what do we do when somebody's yelling at us? We freeze. We get reactive sometimes. And so it's the worst thing to do, but it is the most natural thing for parents and sometimes teachers to do, to just hurry up. So that's, I think it's a really good point.
Right. And then hurrying up is just not a strategy, right? Especially if kids innately can't hurry up.
Well, that's the thing. Nobody wants to be the last at anything. So
right.
No one tries to be last. There is always a reason that we're not, keeping up with our peers, especially the younger we are. Everyone wants to be the quickest. So if they can't do that, there's a reason for it.
Right. Absolutely. And I see that all the time, even with my own kids. It's like a race for everything. It's a contest,
Exactly.
Whatever we decide to do. And when I think about slow processing speed and when I see it in kids that I work with, so many of them have neurodevelopmental disorders like dyslexia, ADHD, dysgraphia. Can slow processing speed occur in isolation? So a lot of parents will ask, my kids doesn't have these labels. It doesn't have this diagnosis, but they work so slowly. And we want to have an understanding of why that is. Have you seen that?
Absolutely. So those were the kids that I became most interested in when I started studying this. There would be a certain group of kids that would come in. And as you said, my research has found that slow processing speed is part of dyslexia in a certain number of kids, ADHD. We used to kind of think that slow processing speed was just inattentive ADHD. We know that's not the case. And so there are two different groups in it, which you're talking about, who don't have other issues. One are kids who just have a very slow processing speed and everything else is average. But because of their slower processing speed, which might be, let's say, at the 10th percentile, that's going to be an impairment, basically, when you're looking at how they're able to interact and complete tasks in a timely manner. But then there are also those kids that I mentioned before who have sort of average processing speed, but have really strong skills in all other areas of cognition. And what we found is that those kids are pretty much the same when we look at their rates of anxiety, when we look at their rates of other kinds of mental health issues as they go on into adolescence. So this real difference compared to your peers, or relative difference, both can impact kids. And in our research, in about 20 or 30% of the cases that we see in our clinic, there might not be an extra diagnosis that is associated with that.
Mm-hmm. And that's really interesting because, parents often want to have a reason, for why their child processes information more slowly. And when it's associated with the dyslexia and ADHD, it's often easier to understand. But when it occurs in bright kids who are, again, capable of this higher level thinking, it's hard to understand that. But I love how you describe that discrepancy. You've got kids who've got really high intellectual functioning, maybe high academic skills and understanding, but average processing speed. And that means that they have a harder time accessing their thinking more quickly.
Exactly. And sometimes for kids who are really bright, their thinking is a lot. So they're really processing a lot of information, which is going to slow all of us down anyway. So, you think about the kinds of big problems that we have in our society right now are not things that are going to be solved quickly. They're going to be things that are thought about for a long time by very bright people. So in a way, this is a real plus. But in our educational system, it's not about solving big problems quickly. It's about doing math quickly. It's about writing that essay in the next 15 minutes. And those are the things that are more difficult. And so it leaves the child feeling more frustrated. I do feel like sometimes it's good to mention that what we're talking about is a brain-based behavior. We're talking about the way the brain processes information. And it could be something related to chemicals in the brain, like neurotransmitters. It could be the case, and I find this in a certain number of kids who I've watched over time, that the brain might just take a little bit longer to develop myelination, which is that sort of coating that our cells have that helps electrical impulses go more quickly in our brain. So for some kids, that just might just be something that's just not ever developed as well, or that takes longer to develop. So I do see some kids who sort of catch up in their other areas of functioning, not many, not all by any means, but that we're really talking about just how quickly people's brains process simple information. It doesn't mean how well they process that information, just how quickly it is able to be processed.
Right. And then when we really see that it's brain-based, we can know that this is not attributed to a motivation within the child or a lack of willingness to work quickly. It really is associated with, again, like you were saying, the way their brain is wired.
Yes. And even in our research, we've shown that processing speed is not at all connected to things like conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder. So it doesn't really have anything it's not correlated at all with either one of those kinds of things that we would expect. If it was a motivational issue, we'd see kids with more oppositional behavior. We don't.
Mm. When you're describing, processing speed in the context of bright kids, and we talked about ADHD. I think about executive functioning, about writing. You use the example of kids who can't write very quickly. And I often think about writing as, really taxing that executive functioning system, because so much is involved in, getting started, task initiation, organizing, planning. And I would love for you to talk about the relationship between processing speed and executive functioning.
So when I started looking at this, I really kind of thought of processing speed as just another executive function. And to be honest, this did not start with a research study. It started with a book, because I had written a book for Guilford Publications. They said, what do you want to write about next? And I said, processing speed. And they're like, what is that? And why is that important? And I didn't really even have a good answer to that question, because it was just sort of thought of as another executive function, like working memory. So they were like, why don't you write about working memory? That's a much hotter topic right now. And this was quite a few years ago. It's going back, over 10 years. And so I just had this hunch, and we did this all backwards, because you're supposed to do the research first and then write the book. But we did the research as we were writing the book too. But I really started to think then that processing speed is like the engine that helps move our executive functioning. It's not really an executive function like working memory or organization or planning or initiation. If we have slow processing speed, all of those things are going to be impaired. And I've seen lots of kids with actually very good executive function skills, but they are slow at processing. And so those good organization skills that they have are impacted by the fact that they can't use those skills in a given period of time. So I kind of see as kind of the motor that propels the car of the executive function skills. And also, you can have very good processing speed and have really poor executive functioning. And those two things, when that happens, you've got a child who's very, very quick and disorganized. And these two kinds of profiles would need very different recommendations.
Right. And that's where the assessment piece comes in, and why it's so important. Because, if I think a kid who's taking a very long time to get that writing assignment done, and we know that child has good processing speed, but poor executive functioning, the intervention is going to be different for that child than the child who has good executive functioning and then slow processing speed.
Exactly. And the other reason I think that evaluation can be very helpful is you can find in that writing process also where are the other key issues. Is it a working memory? Is there also a working memory issue there? So they have trouble coming up with the right word at the right time, or keeping track of what that topic was. Is it a problem with just organization, that they have so many great thoughts, but they don't know where to start? Is it a problem with, any of those sorts of things can be identified. And I think when we're talking about processing speed, the more issues that we can identify in that profile to intervene, the better, because we don't really have any good interventions for just speeding someone up.
Right. Right. And then, when I think about the assessment, you just talked about that, is that, if there's a difficulty with executive functioning, we know that they can be separate from processing speed, but slow processing speed in a person who also has poor executive functioning skills, you're exacerbating the difficulties that they're experiencing. So they are going to need more support than someone who has executive functioning issues, but without the processing speed. Slowness.
That's exactly right. And that's one of the things that I often tell parents. Let's say a child has dyslexia and slow processing speed as part of their profile. I will then recommend really more kinds of treatment times for, like, let's say we recommend Orton Gillingham. Instead of saying 2 times a week, I might say 3 times a week, because that processing speed issue lets us kind of get an inclination to how that child is going to need more time in order to absorb that same amount of material.
Right. And, you just touched on something, which is like the treatment and the intervention. And I get this question a lot. You probably get a lot. Is there anything I can do to fix processing speed?
No. And I wish there was. And we probably get this question at least once a week. I wish we did. We don't even have good medications that work like they do for ADHD. And in fact, sometimes I think in the past, I've had children who were diagnosed with ADHD who were put on medication. It never worked. They were said, they became sort of zombies or, didn't seem to respond at all, kind of lost their affect. And I think in a lot of those cases, they're kids with slow processing speed that actually don't have ADHD. And so therefore, the medications don't work because we're not fixing that. But there are some things that we can do to help assist with processing speed. And one of those things is to help kids learn about time, not just time management. Like we recommend time management so much. But if a child doesn't have a good understanding of what time is, time management, we're asking them to arrange a room when they can't see the room. And so we've learned that kids and adults with ADHD have trouble with time perception. They don't know how much time has passed, if it's 5 minutes, if it's 10 minutes. And so one of the things that I recommend parents do is to really infuse time and the perception of time, the knowledge about time into a child's day, because you want to make sure they know when you say you're going to need 30 minutes to finish that assignment. And they say, no, don't worry, I can get it done right away. Oftentimes they think that because they don't know what 30 minutes is like. So use timers, time things, not just homework, but time how long it takes to get to school in the morning, how long it takes when you have traffic, when you don't have traffic, how long it takes to brush your teeth. So they start to learn what 2 minutes feels like versus 20 versus an hour.
That's wonderful. And so really enhancing the concept of time perception for that child. Are there any other things that can be done? I know that we oftentimes recommend accommodations in the school. Obviously, kids need extra time, but I often find that a lot of kids don't know what to do with that with that extra time. Like, what do? They just sit there and look at their paper. Some kids need more instruction in terms of what to do with that extended time.
Absolutely. I have found that speech and language therapy can be very helpful, especially even for kids who have very good verbal skills, but don't know how to actually access those skills, organize them to generate a written or a verbal output. So for many kids, that executive function of language treatment can be very helpful. Not all speech therapists do it yet, but I think it's increasing in the field. That has been extremely helpful because if you can organize your thoughts, you can get that down on paper. And we're talking about using that extra time on tests. That's important. I think a self-awareness is really important, knowing that it's going to take you longer, acknowledging that, then can help in those times when you're sitting and taking that test to know, oh, here's what I'm supposed to be doing because I know it's going to be taking longer for this. And sometimes there's somewhat of a shame issue with this because you said before, kids love being the first one done. And no one wants to be the last one done. And so sometimes I find that kids, they don't know what to do, but they also don't want to be the last one done. But definitely organizing information, knowing the big picture and where the smaller pieces fit in, which can be very helpful through educational interventions, executive function tutoring can help because you want to know, children need to know, where do I start and how do I fill that in? And then knowing that they have plenty of time to do that helps that process as well.
Right. And, as you're talking about executive functioning and language and how, speech and language therapy can help, it's because all these systems, the processing speed systems, the language systems, the attention systems, they're all connected.
Yes.
Right. And so when we work on one, we're working on other systems as well.
Yes. I should say, too, that in the younger years, occupational therapy can also be very helpful. Just having more practice with those sorts of visual motor skills, hand-eye coordination, especially when we're talking about writing. Again, I'm not really talking about being on the baseball field, but being able to write very quickly really does help. And the more we are able to be the more we're able to sort of integrate these skills, the quicker we are. So we have to find that spot between having kids practice these skills enough so it becomes automatic, but not so much that the whole, their whole education becomes just drudgery and drills. That also does not work very well for kids with this profile.
Yes. And, when I think about these kids with this profile, they're sitting in a classroom, the teacher's teaching a lesson, and that teacher is speaking at a certain rate. And for a child with slow processing speed, they're often missing information. You've touched on, this trouble with keeping up creates those gaps in learning, but can also create some anxiety, which you kind of touched on initially. I'd love for you to speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so it was sort of surprising in our initial research that we found that processing speed is very closely related to anxiety. And it's sort of difficult to figure out if it's a chicken or an egg kind of thing. Does the processing speed cause anxiety because of exactly those things you just said? You didn't hear or you didn't process what the teacher said. You missed social cues in the environment. All of a sudden you're feeling lost, you feel anxious. Or if anxiety sort of exacerbates the processing speed. And it's probably some sort of a cycle that as we get, if you're the last one to sort of get something and then you start to feel anxious about it, you're going to be slower because that's what anxiety does to us. It slows us down and it's adaptive in a way. In this case, it's not very adaptive. It's not like, oh no, what's going on? I better take in all this information. For kids with slower processing speed, anxiety can be really another difficulty for them that then they have to maneuver through. So one of the things you want to make sure kids know is to be aware of that when I feel left behind in the lecture, that I notice that, I'm aware of it, I raise my hand, I go to the teacher after class. And a lot of it is again, the treatment is kind of embracing who we are and knowing that and helping others embrace who that child is too, as opposed to making them feel like they are left behind or there's something to be shameful about this.
Right. And that's where that self-advocacy piece comes in. I think that's so important for kids to develop that skill and that understanding early so they can advocate for themselves in terms of what they need.
Exactly.
Because that can actually contribute to the anxiety as well when they're sitting there and they know they need this extra support, or they know that everyone else has already gone up and handed in their papers and they still have 3 problems left. What to do with that.
Right. And those are the sorts of things that teachers can do in their classroom to make it easier for those kids. I mean, every teacher is going to have 1 or 2 kids with slower processing speed in their classroom. And in a lot of ways, because classrooms, at least pre-COVID, were pretty fast paced, you would find kids, even who didn't have significant processing speed weaknesses, having trouble keeping up because the pace was not in line with development sometimes.
Right. And you've touched on, how processing speed impacts learning. You touched on anxiety. And what oftentimes parents don't also understand is that how processing speed can impact interpersonal relationships. And I think you kind of touched on a little bit, but I'd love to hear a little bit more because, you talk about in your book that we live in this fast-paced world and we talk fast and we shift topics. For a kid with slow processing speed, an adolescent with slow processing speed, that can be very problematic in terms of keeping up with conversations with peers.
It can be. It really reaches its peak in adolescence. And I should say, too, one of the reasons why I became interested in this population is because a lot of times kids who had slower processing speed and no other diagnosis that fit were often referred to rule out autism spectrum at a younger age. And I would see these kids who had problems with social skills reported by their parents and their pediatrician, maybe, who made the referral. And then I would interview the teacher, and the teacher said, no, he's well liked. There's no problems in terms of social relatedness. He just sort of seems a little bit out of it. And so that got us thinking about what is it about social skills? And then our research did show that kids with slower processing speed had significant issues. A large percentage, up to 35% of kids with slow processing speed have significant issues with social skills. And it's because you it requires you to look at something, really quickly process it. As you're coming into a room, you've got to be able to sort of read the room. In a conversation, you've got to be able to hear what someone's saying and simultaneously process how their eyebrow is raised, or if they roll their eyes or shrug their shoulders. All of these things are important. And if you're having trouble processing the information that they're saying, and then you've got to incorporate the visual cues, it can be really tough. And a lot of times we tell kids to focus on someone's face if they're having trouble with social cues. And I've had a number of kids say to me, it's too hard for me. I don't maintain eye contact because I'm trying to concentrate on what they're saying. And that's why I'm not maintaining eye contact. It's not because they can't. It's because sort of like what we do sometimes is we, close our eyes when we're trying to concentrate on something. That's what they sometimes do. But that's not always the right thing to do because they're missing out on other sorts of cues.
Right. And I can imagine that would also exacerbate anxiety, because if you're having these fast-paced conversations, and then by the time you kind of process the information that has been going on in the conversation, you're ready to kind of jump in. Now the conversation has moved on. And so what you were planning to say is no longer relevant. And then those kids don't say anything. And so then they oftentimes look like kids with language delays.
Exactly. Exactly. And if you're in a peer group where you're sort of like I found this, like the child or the young adult or adolescent who's sort of like there and just kind of hanging on, that's fine. But sometimes if you're in a peer group that is sort of living kind of, doing things that they shouldn't be doing, drinking, experimenting with marijuana, you might be the child who gets caught. And then you get in trouble for those sorts of things because you're moving in a peer group that's perhaps very quick and able to sort of lie their way out of things and, hide things. And I do find oftentimes that kids with slow processing speed wind up getting in trouble much more than their peers who are in a similar sort of social sort of environment. So they're just not good at thinking on their feet when they've done something wrong. That's a good thing. Like some of these things we're talking about are really good things that they really, they don't tend to be the kind of child who is an instigator in terms of trouble, but they can get involved in situations that they didn't want to get into because they're not seeing the difficult little cues that are coming through, like, oh, there's a party at someone's house on Friday night, and here's what's happening. They might not really understand and might be the person left kind of, holding the bag.
Mm-hmm. And, when you talk about those kids and you talk about the fact that it may not be a bad thing, I think about back to what you've said initially about that we need people to be thoughtful. We need people to be reflective to solve the problems of the world. We don't need people jumping in with the first thing that pops into their heads. And so embracing slow processing speed can be a good thing because there's advantages to taking your time and thinking things through and being more careful and meticulous in your approach.
Absolutely. This is sort of a cultural thing that in our society, we think to be smart is to be fast. And it's really not true. Like some of the most amazing things that have been developed have come out of people sort of sitting and thinking about things. And we have a lot of huge problems in our society right now. And they're not going to be solved by quick answers. They're going to be solved by people spending time thinking about how these problems can be solved. And so this is a real asset. The tragedy is that a lot of these kids don't make it into college or they don't make it into high school feeling like they are competent or they do have something to give, and they really, really do. So we really have to make sure that they don't end up feeling like they don't have something to contribute when I think they really have an awful lot to contribute.
Absolutely. And I completely agree. Dr. Braaten, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I think the information you shared will be immensely helpful to so many who want to understand and address the challenges of slow processing speed. Thank you for sharing such great insights and information with us today. It was such a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
I hope that you enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Braaten. And if you learned something, I want to hear from you. One of the best things you can do is to leave us a review. Let us know what you thought. And when you do that, it helps other people find us as well. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.